Well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad that you are joining us again for another evening in the Gospel of Matthew, I believe. We are at week 19 and are just over a third of the way through the book. So, we're moving on at a rapid pace here. Um, Again, I feel like I start and end just about every week with this, but if you have not taken the time yet to sit down and read through the Gospel of Matthew, that is the best way to take in our New Testament books, especially. They're meant to be read through in one sitting. They were written to be heard. So either take the time to read out loud or sit quietly with an audiobook of the Bible or somebody else reading it out loud to you and enjoy listening to these words and these teachings in the way that they would have originally been heard by their audience. A couple of points to touch on before we get into our text for the evening. A couple of reminders that I think will help us understand where we're at. The community for which Matthew's gospel is written very likely is a predominantly Jewish community. Sorry about that. A predominantly Jewish community that is now outside of Judea and Jerusalem. Syria is where we tend to think, but that's not overly important. But they are away from home. It's after the destruction of the temple. They're trying to navigate life in their community now, especially now that they've been experiencing rejection. After the destruction of the temple, both Christianity and Judaism, which would not have been looked at as separate entities really at the time, trying to figure out how to redraw their boundaries. What does Judaism look like without the temple? The same question kind of holds for Christianity. And do we have a place in the synagogues where we've always been for these Jewish Christians? And in some synagogues at the time, at least, the answer is no, you don't belong here. And so then where do we belong? And what does that mean for us as Jews? And should we really continue to hold on to Jesus? After all, he hasn't come back. We haven't seen some of the things we had hoped to see. And to those questions and those concerns, Matthew writes. And he writes with the goal of engendering some understanding of Jesus as he is meant to be understood, as opposed to Jesus, the Messiah, as he had been hoped for, and how those are not always the same thing. And in this case, they're not the same thing. I keep adjusting this stand because it looks off, but we're just going to roll with it. So I actually want to start with a quote this evening, which is one of my favorite quotes from all of the research that I did on my master's thesis, which is not something I'm going to dive into right now. But for the sake of information, the dude that we're looking at here, Rudolf Bultmann, was a young minister at churches in Germany towards the tail end of World War I. And as things began to go very, very poorly, a lot of the Christian nationalism that had invaded Germany at the time. And I've got all of these grand sermons and statements about people who were certain that God was on their side because they were this Christian people who were dead set on fixing the world. And even some quotes where they treat themselves as the persecuted Messiah. This should sound vaguely familiar. This happened in every circle that has attached their Christian identity to their national power at some point or another, including here. I've got the same quotes from us. But as things began to go poorly at the end of the war, and it's more and more looking like defeat is on the horizon for Germany, Bultmann and others began to ask questions about whether or not they had seen God poorly. I think that's the best way to say that. So in a sermon that he gives, he says this: if we want to see God, then the first thing we should say to ourselves is that we may not see him as we have conceived. As we have conceived him. For the only way we can see him is as he actually is, which is a very fancy way of saying if what we're doing is looking for our hopes and dreams and expectations in the Messiah, then what we're looking for is an idol, a figment of our own creation, and we're going to miss God and what God is actually doing because what we're looking for is what we hope God will do or is doing. And I think that's an incredibly telling quote, not just for Bultmann and the German Christian community during World War I, but also for us, as that same sort of rhetoric and language shows up in our circles with some level of regularity these days. I think it's a good reminder that just because we attribute something to God or hope that something will happen or expect something to happen, one does not mean that it will, and two doesn't mean that if it does, that it's actually holy, and three doesn't mean that if it doesn't, God's failed. And I think those are good kind of questions for the Jewish Christian community in Matthew. That's Matthew's audience, because there are these hopes and expectations of what the Messiah is going to do and what it will look like, and no less a person than John the Baptist. For our passage today, asks some hard questions about whether or not Jesus is fitting that mold, whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. So chapter 11, verse 1 is where we're going to start. I really should have included it in last week's passage, but it serves a bit as a bridge to this week. So chapter 11, verse 1, when Jesus had finished giving these instructions to his 12 disciples, he went out to teach and preach in towns throughout the region. So Jesus talks about sending and what it looks like to do the mission of God as a disciple. And he doesn't just talk about it. He then goes out and does the very work that he's just instructed them to do. So John the Baptist, verse 2, who was in prison, heard about all the things that the Messiah was doing. So he sent his disciples to Jesus to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we look for someone else?" Now, I think this is a valid question from John. John is in prison because of the work that he has been doing as a way preparer for the Messiah. He knows that his work is attached to the mission of God. But when he hears about Jesus, and predominantly the thing that gets talked about is his teaching. And notice Matthew is emphatic that Jesus is primarily a preacher and teacher of good news. And the miracles, though they certainly happen, are kind of secondary to the work. None of those things really match up with the messianic expectations that exist in the Jewish community at the time. Because Jesus is not showing himself to be any sort of warrior Messiah, any sort of political religious power who's going to bring about freedom politically and militarily, especially during this day from the Romans who are exerting power over Jewish Palestine. John, as one who is in prison, is especially concerned that that overthrow take place quickly because his life sort of depends on it. Political military Messiah, one in the guise of the kings of old, like David, is way more interesting or way more exciting to the people of Jesus' day, John included, than a prophet who, often lost their lives while trying to move the people in the correct direction. And if you've got to take a pick between the two as a domineered people at the time, you want the warrior. So John sends his disciples to ask this question. If John had heard about what Jesus was doing and those actions and activities confirmed what he was hoping for, he never sends somebody to ask a question. But John's concerned whether or not he's put his hopes and expectations in the right person, or maybe he misunderstood. And what's going to happen to him? So Jesus responds to John's disciples, "Go back and tell John what you have heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And then he added, "God blesses those who do not fall away because of me." So verses 4 and 5 give us a list there of the things that Jesus has been doing. And everything on that list is directly related to prophecies concerning the inbreaking of God in the form of the Messiah in the future. And those come from Isaiah 29, Isaiah 35, Isaiah 26, Isaiah 42, in Isaiah 61. And if you read through those sections that Jesus either alludes to indirectly or quotes directly right here to John, there is one notable thing that shows up in those passages, but is not included on the list that Jesus gives John. And this is to me fascinating and also telling. And that's from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. There's your primary statement in 61, your tone setter, and something that's just been directly quoted by Jesus in this passage. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and that prisoners will be freed. Now, John knows the Old Testament. He knows the prophets. John, as a prophet, is certainly acquainted with the prophets of old, and John hears in Jesus' response these allusions and quotations of Isaiah, and John would also, I think, have noticed the one that was left out. That of all of these, Isaiah quotes that Jesus reaches for, the freedom of prisoners and captives is not one of the ones that's mentioned to John, who is a prisoner, a captive at the time. Which is why I think it's telling that we get this last verse. God blesses those who do not fall away because of me. It's sort of a way of Jesus saying, this is who the Messiah is. And I don't know that I want to call it an apology, and I'm sorry that what you're hoping for is not coming to pass, but it is this recognition that the Messiah has come to do these types of things. And maybe that means that the hopes and dreams of the people of John for what might come down the road is missing. I think we like to think that guys like John got it, understood, that somehow God passed down a handwritten manifesto of here's exactly what's in front of you. But the more you read about what's going on, the less and less I conceive that of being a reality. I think John knew that he was doing the work of God. He was providing voice to the will of God, but had no clue what it was going towards. And what he sees in Jesus doesn't line up with what he hopes might happen. And I think, again, this Bultmann quote kind of leads itself that direction. I think there are moments where we experience that same sort of thing. Sometimes it comes across in very hard but not unusual questions. If God is just, then why insert thing here? Because what we are hoping for and what we are experiencing don't line up. So as John's disciples walk away to carry this message to John, Jesus turns to the crowd to talk about John. And again, what he ends up talking about is the gap between expectations and desires on one side and reality on the other. As John's disciples were leaving, verse 7, Jesus began to talk to the crowds. What kind of man did you go to the wilderness to see? Was he a weak reed, swayed by every breath of wind, or were you expecting to see a man dressed in expensive clothes? No, people with expensive clothes live in palaces. Were you looking for a prophet? Yes, and he is more than a prophet. John is the man to whom the scriptures referred when he said, look, I am sending my messenger out ahead of you, and he will prepare the way before you. So it's kind of fun, but all three of these images point towards, indirectly point towards Herod Antipas at the time. Herod was depicted on a coin during the time of Jesus and of John holding a reed. He was certainly one who was finely dressed and who lived in palaces, one of the only people in the land of Palestine who would have lived in a palace at the time. So there is this question that's held up in front of the people. What were you looking for? What were you hoping? What were you expecting? Were you looking for royalty, or were you looking for a voice in the line of the prophets of old? And what they have to respond to, because they knew as they headed into the desert to hear John, was that they were not going to hear a king. Nothing about John was kingly. Certainly not his diet, certainly not his clothes, and his message did not come in the guise of the royalty of old. He was a prophetic voice. And so there has to be some recognition on behalf of the people that what they are listening to now, from John to Jesus, is more like the prophets and less like the kingship. I was about to say kingdom, but that's a terrible word in this case because it is the kingdom of God. It's not the kingdom of men. Verse 11 continues, I tell you the truth, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. Yet even the least person in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is. And from the time John the Baptist began preaching until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing and violent people are attacking it. For before John came, all the prophets and the law of Moses looked forward to this present time. And if you are willing to accept what I say, he is Elijah, the one the prophets said would come. Anyone who has ears to hear should listen and should understand. So again, we get more about John the Baptist, but less so about John himself and more about God's work in the kingdom of heaven. John is sort of held up here as a transitionary figure, one who moves the people from the prophets of old to Jesus. But especially important, not just for the people who heard Jesus as he was talking about John the first time, but for Matthew's audience, is this recognition that all along the way, as God has been working, there has always been pushback. The references to Moses and to the prophets is a reference to the rebellion of the people. Like, Moses' time is marked by a refusal to listen to God all along the way, including by Moses, who died and is buried outside the promised land because of the way in which his own hopes and expectations and inability to navigate faithfully in all aspects left him on the outside looking in. The prophets are voices who remind the people over and over and over of the expectations of God and the gap that exists between what God wants and what they are doing, and trying to move the people in that direction. And then John certainly is a voice who does the very same thing. And then, so Jesus, I love the statement. Anyone who has ears to hear should listen and understand. It's a really nice way of saying, do you get the point yet? Are you willing to hear? And that, too, is a very important question because in some ways our understanding is tied to our willingness to understand. If you only hope for a militant Messiah, then you are never going to see a redemptive one. If you only hope for political power and victory, you're never going to understand sacrifice and obedience. Those don't meld together at all. So in some ways, what we see in 7 through 15 is a mirror of what we see from John in 2 through 6. I kind of divided it up simply this way. In verses 2 through 6, you get John's expectations and concerns about Jesus, whether or not he is truly going to accomplish what John wants him to accomplish. And the answer is, sure, but not in the way that you're thinking. And 7 through 15 are kind of the same way, where Jesus is asking questions about what their expectations and hopes and dreams were. And then here at the end, in the last little bit, verses 16 through 19, we get these statements about the reality of the messianic work, who Jesus truly is, what Jesus is truly doing. So Jesus asks this question to the people in front of him. To what can I compare this generation? It is like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends, we played wedding songs and you didn't dance. We played funeral songs and you didn't mourn. For John didn't spend his time eating and drinking, and you say he's possessed by a demon. Son of Man, on the other hand, feasts and drinks, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard, and friends of tax collectors and other sinners. But wisdom is shown to be right by its results. It's another way of saying you're paying attention to the wrong things. You're looking to the wrong things. And in some ways, it's also asking a question of whether or not they're willing to truly listen and understand, or if they're going to let their own preconceived notions, understandings, ideas, expectations, hopes, dreams, all of those things be the stumbling block over which they fall in their pursuit of the Messiah. Because if they're unable to see, if they are unwilling to hear, then they are never going to get what God truly is doing, what the kingdom of heaven in the form of Jesus, as brought by Jesus, is truly all about. And I think that's an open question for them who first heard these words from Jesus, for those who first read the story as recorded by Matthew in Syria, and for us who are looking back on this and experiencing many of the same things. We have our own hopes and dreams and expectations and things we believe should and shouldn't happen, and ways in which we try to attach God to what we want. And that has been ongoing and constant for as long as people have been following God. Like, read the Old Testament, read the New Testament, look at history. You see it played out over and 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 over again. So are we going to notice and pay attention? Are we going to see God as God truly is, see Jesus as he truly was? Or are we going to allow what we want to have happen get in the way of genuine pursuit of God and the actual kingdom that God brings, as opposed to the ones that we would prefer God brought? I think those are hard questions. I think Bultmann and his contemporaries just over 100 years ago had to deal with those questions, because what they thought should happen, where they thought God was, what they saw God doing, didn't turn out. And I think it's foolish of us to think that we are not prone to the exact same mistakes. In fact, I could point you to a dozen or two books right now that are making all of the same mistakes Bultmann did. In the same way that John and others in the time of Jesus were torn between what they saw Jesus doing and the good that Jesus was doing, but it wasn't what they wanted Jesus to do. So I think there are some important lessons here to navigate all of that. All right, I'm going to stop for the evening. Again, reminder, if you've not done so already, sit down and read through Matthew. Listen to it being read to you. Pay attention. Listen for the rhythms and patterns and words that are used and repeated in the ways in which Jesus is guiding a community to what God is actually doing versus what they may have hoped God would do, because this is not the only place it shows up in Matthew's gospel. All right, glad you were with us this evening, or whenever you get a chance to watch this. We'll be back at it next week and continue on with chapter 11. Y'all have a good one.